Step 3 of an outbreak investigation is to identify and characterize the cause of the outbreak. There are several types of information we'll use to do this. For instance, clinical evidence. So in the case of monkeypox, for instance, we would know it's not measles and that it was likely monkeypox or a similar pox virus based on the type of rash it occurs. So here we have a monkeypox case on the left and a measles case on the right. And you can see in the monkeypox, we have these big, large raised pustules, whereas measles is a much softer, more level rash of a lot of little red dots. So these very different looks can allow us to distinguish these two types of cases. Another bit of evidence comes from the epidemiological course of an outbreak. You remember how I described different types of epidemic curves for different kinds of exposure before. So epidemiological evidence can include a common exposure. So what do cases have in common that people who do not get sick don't have in common? The age distribution of cases might help give us clues. Is it all among children, among the elderly? Different diseases tend to affect different people at different times of their life. Also, the type of epidemic, as characterized by the epidemic curve. Is it a point source outbreak, a common source, propagated? And then finally, the incubation period of the disease may give further clues into what the cause is. So the incubation period is a concept we haven't talked about before, so let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. So here we have a curve that you've seen before showing the epidemic curve for a point source outbreak. Just to remind you, we start with a rapid increase in the number of cases, and then we have a large right tail. So this log normal distribution or long tail distribution is also the distribution that we see when we compare the time that people are infected with a disease to the time in which they develop symptoms. This is called the incubation period, and it has this characteristic form for most diseases. So based on the median of this distribution, that is the time from when the people were exposed to the symptom onset, we can have a sense of what caused the disease. Likewise, if we know what caused the disease, we can use this distribution to see what the most likely time of exposure is. So just to reiterate, the incubation period is the time from infection to symptom onset. This shouldn't be confused with the latent period, which is the time for infection to becoming infectious. And these are sometimes confused, and they're not always the same. For instance, for HIV, it can be years between when somebody's infected and when they develop AIDS, but they're infectious almost immediately after infection. So they have a long incubation period and a short latent period. So here I showed an epidemic curve that we've seen before on the left, and we're comparing that with the incubation period of several diseases. So, for instance, adenovirus has a median incubation period of around 6 days. SARS has a median incubation period of around 4 days. Influenza, 1.5 days. Parainfluenza, 2.6 days. Respiratory syncytial virus, 4.4 days. And rhinovirus, 1.9 days. Looking at this epidemic curve, where we have a median time to symptom onset of 5 days, we'd probably rule out influenza, parainfluenza, and rhinovirus as possible causes based on that information. A final piece of evidence in identifying the cause that's becoming more and more important as time goes on is laboratory evidence. So this can be of two types. One is based on the organism, so organism typing that can be molecular, that is genetic, microscopy, that is going and actually looking at the pathogen on a slide, culture, so attempting to grow the pathogen on some media, and drug resistance testing for outbreaks of diseases that may be drug resistant. So for instance, on the bottom, we see an example like that where we have a gel that has a gray pattern with dark lines on it, and these dark lines indicate the genetic structure of the pathogen and allow us to characterize this particular pathogen and how they relate to each other. Another piece of evidence that's often used is immunological evidence, particularly acute antibodies. So this is like IgM, which is an antibody that we develop soon after being infected with a pathogen but doesn't stick around. And this is another piece of evidence that can help us identify the cause. To summarize the key points from this section, there are 3 key sources of evidence on what causes an outbreak: clinical evidence, the symptoms people get; epidemiological evidence, when and where cases are occurring. And laboratory evidence, the characteristics of the pathogen and the disease response we have. And none of these alone are definitive. Just for example, we might be tempted to say laboratory evidence is always definitive. But suppose that everybody was testing positive for influenza, but the big symptom in this outbreak was a rash. Rashes aren't necessarily symptoms of influenza, so that would suggest that that was a finding that wasn't completely relevant to what was causing this outbreak, and we might have to turn to the clinical and epidemiological evidence and do more laboratory testing. As an exercise in thinking about the incubation period, let's think about when the exposure was to the disease we've been looking at in the past couple exercises. So I'm going to tell you right now, this disease is the plague. And the median incubation period of the plague is 3 days. It ranges between 2 to 6 days. So the median day of symptom onset for this outbreak was March 16th. So you need to think about when is the most likely day of exposure given that information.